Maybe you just put Gepard and want to figure out what are the best teams for him, or perhaps you already set your eyes on him, he's your favorite character and you want to build a team around for him. And this video will be covering both of those questions, and as well as coming up with a free-to-play team for him, and we'll add a little bit more gacha as we go along the video and get to the whale team comps later on. But if you stay to the end, I assure you there's something for you to learn regardless of how much of spending power you're planning to do in the game as well. And if I were to give like a phrase to describe Gepard, he's really like an iron wall. With him, you can actually form some hyper-aggressive comps coming from the other 3 slots. In my opinion, Gepard teams will probably be one of the first few teams to clear the Memory of Chaos in Honkai Star Rail, especially because the amount of shielding and the value that he provides is just so significantly higher than other standard characters in the game as well. For those of you who don't know, any character shield is extremely thin with like about 100 or maybe even 200 at best kind of shielding power, whereas Gepard's shield at base, like without any gear at all, at level 80 is probably around half of most characters' HP bar. That is really massive considering that it doesn't even like haven't included his gear and equipping him for defense and stuff like that. Very massive shield, and he's also the character with the highest amount of base stats in the game. If you see this chart here, we just take each of their stat values and divided it by the average and sum it up. And we will actually see, when sorted by highest to lowest, Gepard has the highest stat value compared to any other character in the game. A stat of 1 of course is average, and anything above that is above average. Now let's get into the free-to-play team, and I think with Gepard you can actually choose to run a very offensive main comp, which means that you might even hold off going for defensive units like main character as well as Natasha, and you can put them in your other team together. This allows you for a lot of flexibility because when you have these 2 characters, you actually settle another Memory of Chaos team and you already have one solid team with Gepard acting as a very rock solid foundation. A very straightforward team, a lot of damage early on, and I think this is probably one of the better teams in terms of well-roundedness, with good attack buffs, good speed buffs for the whole party, solid defensive ability, good scaling to late game, as well as good AOE damage coming from both of them. One thing to note, of course, Qingque drinks a lot of skill points and Esta does as well, and these 2 are conflicting in terms of role, but you could always play, for example, Serval in this slot as well. And of course, as we add a little bit more gacha, the first character and probably the biggest character that comes into mind is definitely Arlen. Arlen likes to play at very low life and he doesn't really like getting healed up to full health. So what he needs really is a very thick shield for him to do a lot of damage. In this sense, Arlen and Gepard really works well because Gepard basically gives him like a 50% HP shield and allows him to be played, Arlen be played at very low life, maybe like less than 30%, to get his full amount of multipliers when he's at very low life. He's an underrated character and he's also an underrated character, and together both of them really come together quite strongly, especially when you pair a character like Esta who speeds them both up to give them more action turns. They can use their ultimate more often, as well as giving attack buffs to both of them. In this sense, because Arlen doesn't even eat skill points, you can pair very nicely with a character like Esta who drinks quite a bit of skill points, especially if you don't get the RNG right. This team does feed Estas in terms of skill points pretty well. In terms of AOE options, I'll probably be playing the same team. You could also consider running Sampo as well. Very aggressive team, as you can see, only just 1 defensive unit and the other 3 has no form of defensive position whatsoever. Very hyper aggressive team, and Gepard really opens up the roster to these kind of formations. You realize that the characters mentioned here in this team comp are hardly mentioned in the other videos, and I think this is where Gepard really stands out compared to the rest. The teams that he allows you to play touches on a lot of other peripheral characters that are not really addressed in the other team compositions that I've recommended in other videos already, making him a very good diversifier if you're planning to clear Memory of Chaos early, and he's my secret to being able to clear Memory of Chaos, probably one of the first few with his amount of stat pooling. And at the end of the day, turn-based games are all a numbers game, and Gepard definitely edges out in that sense. In terms of 5-star characters that do really well with him, let's start off with the person who wants to use Gepard the most, and definitely will be a character like Yanqing. Although they are both ice and might be conflicting, you could diversify out. Eventually, if there's an ice team buffer or something like that, they could see quite good value, and they also work really well together because Yanqing doesn't like to take damage, and the talent passive that he has gives him more crit rate if he doesn't take any damage. Gepard's very chunky shield, 50% or more of the target's life, definitely will make a very huge difference, especially allowing Yanqing to build like full offensive stats, and it really protects a lot of squishier characters who just want to seek more damage as well. And in terms of the third slot, you could run a character, for example, like Ting Che, Serval, or Erudition characters with a bit of AoE. A slightly lower priority might be Arlen because his splash damage is not as significant as in terms of AoE damage compared to the rest of these characters. And in the last slot, you can really run attack buffer like Esta. You can run Ting Yun as well if you want to hyper carry one of these units. And Pela is also another attractive option. One thing to know is, of course, Gepard is also not only good because he's a tank and is so defensive, but he also uses gear that your other characters generally won't use. In the whole game, I think only a few characters will probably use defense stats. For example, maybe Mark 7 and, for example, main character. And Gepard can use defense items very well, as well as HP percentage items, allowing you to throw all your quote-unquote junk gear towards Gepard and makes him very cheap to build as well, while you focus more on your other gear for damage dealing characters that are really heavily invested. Very efficient to build. I think that's something that's quite underrated in his kit as well. Well, can be played in the 4th slot, where you normally will play like a buffer in the 4th slot. You can then run an AoE attacker, and your slot 2 could be a character that is more of a single target bursty unit. For example, as we see here. And if you pull Himiko and Gepard, I think a very attractive team composition you can do is any characters in combination in this image that you see here definitely works, but you could possibly run Arlen together with Himiko and finally Esta or Ting Yun in this position. What this means is you have very good shielding for Arlen to do a lot of single target damage with a little bit of splash on the side. You have very strong AoE damage from Himiko as well as a damage buffer. And the key benefit of Gepard over Bailu, if some of you might be wondering, is shielding actually increases your effective HP, making squishies be able to sustain one-shot damage, which otherwise without the shield they would have been one-shotted. And if you can't survive a one-shot, no matter how much healing that you have, you generally won't really find much benefit in a healer in that team. So characters that find tons of value with Gepard are characters that are relatively squishy or they don't even want to be healed to begin with. And that is the main advantage of Gepard over Bailu. I don't really like them together because you can easily run Bailu in the other half of the Memory of Chaos, and you can see tremendous amount of value as well in both of them. And in terms of Clara and Gepard, I've already talked about this team more in the Clara team comp videos, but basically I think that this is a team composition that is going to do really well, especially if you're super underleveled. When your enemies are like one-shotting your whole team because you're trying to tackle content you're not supposed to, for example, you're pushing the Memory of Chaos at very underleveled state, Gepard's very thick shield and both of their stat efficiency in terms of them being like the top 3 in terms of overall stats, together with Clara's damage reduction as well as counter ability, you get tons of efficiency for every resource that you're putting in. What this means is you can easily run a double defensive unit like these two characters here. They split the aggro up between them, and assuming that the boss hits them 50% of the time each, you can actually share the damage and mitigate a lot of damage out this way and be able to push through harder content. This allows you to run a very aggressive slot 2 and slot 4 with like a pure damage dealer, even if they are slightly less geared in terms of defensive position. As long as they can dish out enough damage, you'll probably be able to clear the content much quicker than a lot of other people. I think that's the only situation I'll put both of these together. Otherwise, you could easily find them apart and have very solid teams on their own as well. Let's talk about some husbando, since if you guys are playing Gepard, maybe you are wanting to create a husbando team. Jingyuan works really well in this slot as well as Blade, but let's talk first about Jingyuan. So when you have Jingyuan in this slot, he generally is a hyper carry kind of character, and in my recommendation, I think if you have Gepard in this slot, you don't even need any other defensive position. You could even run, for example, Esta and Ting Yun as a double support to buff up Jingyuan. He does a lot of damage. Even if when you stack so much attack buffs on him, he probably will do a very significant amount of single target damage as well. In this comp, I think if you have enough resources, you can go for a Gepard Jingyuan into a double attack buffer, hyper carry kind of style, and it's really only possible with a character like that is so defensive, like Gepard, or maybe even some extent Bailu. But we'll talk about Bailu's situation in another team composition video as well. And Blade is another character that will benefit really quite well from Gepard. Now, for those of you who don't know, Blade is very similar to Arlen, who really relies on manipulating his HP bar to do a lot of damage. He's not like Arlen, where the lower life he is, the better he is in terms of damage. He's a character that generally scales off of his max HP as well as attack, and he manipulates his HP bar in terms of when he casts his skills, it might go too low sometimes, and then he lifesteals it up after certain conditions are being met. What this means is his HP bar is very erratic, and a character like Gepard helps to stabilize that erraticness quite a bit, and making him a much more easier character to play. In this sense, you can easily run run, for example, attack buffer in the 4th slot, or an AOE break, defense break character in the 4th slot, and your slot 3 can of course be a more single target damage kind of unit. You could even run Ireland in this slot together with Blade, and both of them work pretty well together since you have a ton of shielding from Gepard already in terms of the defensive position. You can run any other single target DPS here. You can run Su Sang, you can run Yanqing and stuff like that, depending on how much resources you have here. And of course you could run a character like Zila in this 3rd slot here to also do a lot of single target damage, depending on what your resources are like. Anyway, do like and subscribe if you want to see more of such content. I've already done a lot of other team composition videos, so do check it out if you're interested. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.